Hello and welcome to Resurface at Abandoned Normal Devices, a series of Sunday evening dialogues imagined to bring us together remotely, to question collectively our possible futures. So please participate and ask questions in the chat below.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Dhaliwal. I am a climate justice campaigner and creative, and I'm really excited to be with you today for the festival, even though we're here together in this virtual space to explore the culture of art and activism. Just to give you a quick audio description, I am sitting in front of a stone wall. There's a plant beside me, and I've got some popping red lipstick on today just to create a sense of being out and about with you. And on the screen, there's an image of holding a megaphone to my ear as a listening device. And actually, that's where I'm gonna start today, talking to you about my practice as someone who moves between the worlds of art and activism and humanitarian resistance. I think it's really crucial that at this time when we're facing multiple crises, that we rethink many of the ways in which we conduct activism, how we work as cultural practitioners, and how we communicate between these fields. So, most of my work started in traditional activism, looking at extraction, Indigenous rights, and climate justice. But what I found was that as the years went by and as I was doing the practice, I needed time to reflect and to think about how this activism was happening, how it was unfolding, what it was doing to me, and also ways to move through the changing landscape. So what I actually did was I took this megaphone and I rewired the engineering in the device and actually turned it into a listening device. And this was to really make visible the fact that as activists, as people of color resisting extraction and so many injustices at this time, there's so much work, there's so much process and research that happens before we get on the megaphone. So this idea of turning the megaphone upside down, of inverting its function, was a way to really visualize and make manifest what I was experiencing as an activist. As I said, that so much of the work is before we get on the megaphone and is about listening and for presencing and being close to the situations that we're talking about. So I just wanted to bring that image to you at the beginning of rethinking the tools and the ways that we do activism as a practice in itself. So I'm just going to now zoom back out a little bit and bring us into the context that we find ourselves in. When we talk about climate change and the environmental situation, sometimes we're thinking about these scenarios in the future. It ends up often being about parts per million, some catastrophic future. But for me, this work has been primarily at the interface of Indigenous rights, resource extraction, and the land rights for communities to have the right to say which projects go ahead on their territories. So for me, as I started to do this work, I was looking at some of the bio hotspots. Those are places that have carbon sinks on the planet, which keep our climate in balance. So we often think of the Amazon as being one of those spaces, but this is the boreal forest. So as I started to think about the climate crisis, connect the dots with extraction, what I started to find was that most of the places where the fossil fuels are, where these resources are that need to be kept in the ground, are actually under Indigenous territory. So this picture is actually the boreal forest. On the top, you can see that, this is boreal forest. It's one of the most important carbon sinks on the land. It's home to numerous indigenous communities. The freshwater that there feed many traditional communities that have lived there since time immemorial. And what it's been turned into, as you can see below, is an absolute wasteland, what the late lawyer Polly Higgins would call ecocide. So this landscape is essentially cannot be remediated. It will take, maybe hundreds of years to recuperate, if it can recuperate. And those communities that were reliant upon this territory can no longer, take water from there. It's an absolute wasteland. And I've walked through this space, and when you're walking there are cannons that go off every minute to keep the animals and birds from landing there. It's a literal war on the land. So all this to say that when we're talking about the climate crisis and we're thinking about where it's happening, it's already happening in time and space now. And it's actually part of a devastation of landscapes and territories that's been happening essentially since 1492, since the beginning of colonialism, since the beginning of extracting and destroying landscapes. So, this is just kind of where we find ourselves. We're at this tipping point. We may have already passed it, where this race for heavy oil, for devastating oil, is what is pushing us into this climate catastrophe. So for the past 15 years, I've been looking at ways to make visible the way in which we are implicated within this crisis, and to try and connect the dots between extraction, climate change, and also the rights of Indigenous peoples. So again, just one last image here for us to really get this this understanding that these landscapes have already been transformed, these communities have already been displaced, and the oil that's been extracted from here is actually tar sands oil, which is basically bitumen, and it needs to be refined 3 to 5 times for it to be turned into oil, and it needs 3 to 5 barrels of water. So it's absolutely energy logic upside down. It's basically like using, getting the last dregs out of the bottom of the barrel, essentially. And Canada actually uses high amounts of natural gas, and even contemplated using nuclear energy to blast the tar sands oil out of there. So this is where we're at. We're at a point where our economies are dependent on heavy oil such as this, and the climate crisis is completely interconnected with keeping these fossil fuels in the ground. So when we talk about decolonizing the climate movement, when we think about decolonial climate movements, we have to make sure it's connected to landscape and it's connected to the land. So one of the things that I do and look at is to look at cultures of organizing themselves. And this brings us back to that image of the listening device at the beginning, that as we move into spaces where we are activating, where we are creating forms of resistance, it's really important for us to take a step back and to think about the cultures of organizing that already exist there, and the multiple forms that this resistance takes. So while sometimes that can be, protest or shutting down refineries, all of those forms of activism, there are cultures of organizing that exist within those territories that we have to see how we work alongside. And they're not always part of the, so-called rational, mechanistic worldviews. They also involve prayer and healing and being with that landscape. So when we look at cultures of organizing and decolonizing them, it's really, really important to bring in to that the manifold ways in which activism, resistance takes place, and all of the metaphysical views, philosophical views, and relationships to the land that involves as well. So I think that's one thing for us to keep in mind, that before we move into addressing the climate crisis, and sometimes the scale of the urgency, the scale of the catastrophe can hurry us up and make us think we need to act. when actually we also need to take a slowing down and a listening to see where we situate ourselves within those movements, and also those cultures that already exist, and also the forms and the needs of the communities that have already been resisting these sites of extraction, as I said, since 1492. So in 2009, just to bring you back to the story about the tar sands oil, which is in Alberta, Canada, that's where that extraction is taking place, although there are tar sands oil across the globe, heavy oil across the globe. What happened in 2009 was that I started to see that, you know, there was a need for international escalation around understanding the rights of Indigenous people in Canada. The scale of the tar sands, you know, you can fly over that for a long time before you see the end of it. The total size of the scale of destruction is the size of England and Wales. So this is a huge landscape that is being devastated. So at the time I was in the UK, and I started to think about what is the relationship between what is happening in Canada with the UK. And I think that's a real big part of mapping out the pipelines of literal oil, but also money, corporate power, legal power. How do we all connect together with this? And so at the time, it was really difficult to get any of the major NGOs to take this seriously. At the time, there wasn't this connection between climate change and biodiversity and Indigenous rights. So I set about just creating this organization myself with one of the editors of the New Internationalist. And the first thing that we did was to design this logo with the chief of the communities in Fort Chipewyan. And you can see that in the center of the logo, there is this, this blood oil drop. And at first it was a black drop of oil, but the chief said to us, you know, this needs to be a red dot because this is essentially it's our blood, it's blood oil. So from the beginning of the organization that we set up to internationalize and amplify the First Nations communities, we needed to make sure that all of the design, all of the branding, all of the imagery was in line with the communities, and also that they were having a say in everything that happened. And I think that's a really crucial point, especially when we are making art, we're making works, or we're taking action in the UK or in Europe on behalf of or in solidarity of communities, because it's often those communities that will feel the impacts on the ground of those actions. And also the sophistication of the asks needs to be done in consultation as well. So while we might want the tar sands to shut down because of the climate implications, we have to also think about the economic local implications of that. For instance, a lot of Indigenous people are employed within the oil sector. So, you know, trying to shut down that industry has impacts on the jobs for those communities. So we also need to think about just transition of jobs. So that's just to say that, you know, all of the climate campaigns that we're seeing at the moment, you know, have these big asks, these calls to stop extraction, to divest from big oil. However, what is it replacing, and what is at stake for those communities on the ground? So that's just something, again, bringing it back to that listening device at the beginning, of doing consultation, of doing mapping, of taking that time to understand the root causes of the crisis in that place, and also all the ways in which it impacts the communities on the ground, and also thinking of solutions. So I would just, you know, urge that as you bring your creative practice into these spaces of activism, of climate justice, to understand how it's connected to the land struggle, how it's connected to the social issues connected with those communities, and also to imagine a bit into the asks. If the oil companies leave that place, which we need, what are the alternatives? How will that territory be cleaned up? And that's something that we're seeing a lot of now when we see these calls to divestment, to divest from these oil companies. Who will clean up the land, and what kind of imaginaries and work will that involve to redesign and to recuperate those ecologies? So as you can see at the bottom here, there's image of some of the actions that we did outside of the, this is the Canada House in London, Trafalgar Square. And as we know, there's a huge sort of opportunity or power that comes with media and imagery that comes out of London. Especially with Canada, we found that when we did, even a small action like this outside Canada House, it had this reverberation back in Canada, and we were able to amplify the voices of those communities on the ground. And we've seen that recently with the huge outpouring of love and solidarity for communities in Palestine and Gaza, that there is this power of solidarity and imagery. And so making sure that we realize that power and privilege, but that we take that time and care with how we articulate the messages and how we also build in longevity into that campaign as well. As I said, this campaign started in 2009, and it's been since then that we've been working in solidarity with those communities as well. So as I mentioned, that, this image that we have of this oil extraction that's happening all the way in Canada, there are these connections to the UK in terms of the treaties that were signed with those Indigenous communities, and also, this power of media. Another way that the UK and Europe is implicated and how we can connect the dots is looking at the financing. So a lot of the financing for these projects was coming from the UK. This was back in about 2010. And we were looking at how these banks, such as Royal Bank of Scotland, corporations such as BP, how they were driving these projects that were pushing us into climate chaos. So as well as challenging these organizations, it was about making visible the complicity of the banking system with climate change and pinning a sort of the dots in how the project financing here was driving the destruction of these communities' territories. So we worked a lot with these kind of stunts, and you see a lot of these stunts now in activism, but this was some of the beginnings of that imagery, and working a little bit with the strange, making enough of a spectacle that you can get the press to come out, but at the same time, we had to make sure that it wasn't so violent that there would be implications for the communities back home. So I think that's a really important strategy and principle as well, is how can you play with the strange? How can you play with the spectacle? We can't always go towards some of the we have to have this space of non-violence and creativity when we're working in solidarity. I think it's very different if there's a community in their territory having to use violence to resist violence versus when we're taking actions in solidarity. So the imagery of that becomes really important, how you present that, how you play with the press, and how to really make a complex issue such as, the financing of fossil fuel projects digestible and understandable as well. And the image at the bottom, that happened just after the Gulf spill disaster by BP. And so, it looks like any action that you might see, but we made sure that we also built time to create relationship between the communities in Bristol who took this action outside the BP AGM at the Excel Centre in London, with those communities in the Gulf Coast, so that we can build those longevity of the relationships and also the asks that were being presented to British Petroleum. We want them to stop deep sea drilling, but also there were needs on the ground to, investigate the impacts of Corexit that was used to clean up the oil, restoration of livelihoods for the fisher people whose lives had been destroyed. So that's something to think about, that, beyond the illustration of the situation, beyond the, display of outrage at these corporations and banks, we also have to work into it, the nuance and the door that we open to these powers, to these corporations, to these banks. We have to think about, what are we doing when we go through those doors, and what are we asking for, and what are we building as well? So continuing with that, we've looked at the banks, we've looked at the corporations. Another big part of the way that climate change is being pushed forward and some of the invisible powers at play is through the legal instruments. So a lot of the what was happening with the tar sands was that Canada was trying to stop European initiatives to stop this fossil fuel from coming to Europe. Europe was trying to regulate its oil and was trying to pass a really obscure piece of European legislation to stop it coming in. And at the time, Canada was in free trade negotiations with Europe. So there was behind the scenes, there was lobbying happening. And we all know that this is continually happening, that the governments are being lobbied by the fossil fuel industry. In this case, they were being lobbied by the Canadian and UK government to keep this oil moving. So again, that's quite a complex process of European legislation that went on for years. So we had to think about ways of how can we make this piece of legislation visible? How can we make it interesting? How can we expose this power? So with this, I worked with felt artist Lucy Sparrow. She's a great artist, check her out. She makes all kinds of sex shops and things completely out of felt. So we collaborated with her to make this installation on the steps of Canada House when there was a meeting taking place where Canada and the UK were lobbying against this EU fuel directive. And another reason why we made these kind of soft structures that showed the felt impacts of the tar sands. It showed the animals with the cancers, the tumors, that were caused by the cancers from the tar sands. We had these kind of soft pipelines, was also that people who can't necessarily take direct action in person because of their legal status in the UK, because of the different ways in which police respond to us in terms of our race, in terms of our gender, we wanted to have ways that people could get involved in the activism outside of that. So people came to sewing sessions where we sewed the animals, we talked about the issues. So that was also another way for people to have an entry point into participating, in taking part, but also this idea of reaching new audiences. So reaching this new audience that Lucy brought with her that was, more interested in like felt dildos than in climate change, but suddenly they were also interacting with this conversation about oil. In addition to also looking at banks and corporations and this legislative infrastructure, we also looked at the art world itself and how the art world works to provide a sort of social license for oil to operate. And what I mean by that is that, here, this is a picture from outside the Tate Summer Party, which was, BP were there, they were present. We used to see their logo a lot more over all of the galleries. But what we really tried to do was to bring into question with groups like Art Not Oil, Liberate Tate, what is the role of the art gallery in terms of allowing oil companies to, through their sponsorship, clean up some of these acts, clean up some of these acts of ecocide, of environmental devastation. And so that's something that, has resulted in BP, being shook out of their relationship. It's something that continues to happen. And it's a question that continues for cultural practitioners of, how do you both expose that relationship, play with that relationship, interact with those spaces of power, but how do we also imagine the future of the gallery and the future of our works with that complicity with those corporations there, and how do we imagine the financing of our cultural work in the future as well? And so I think one thing that I really want to stress is that, these actions have been taking place for, myself personally for over about 10, 12 years. And it can become really exhausting. And we hear a lot about that in terms of burnout and fatigue. And I think one of the things that I tried to do was to continually keep experimenting with the form and to keep thinking about this question of new ways that we could tell these stories that the form could reach new audiences, that we could enter into it through different ways. So this was a piece that I worked with a hat designer, and we developed a series of 12 hats for the royal family when they were attending, Kate Middleton, when she was attending a tour of Canada. And the idea was to, you know, present her with these hats, which were to point attention to the, you know, the Commonwealth relationship between Canada and the UK, to show them the amount of destruction that's happening there. But also another part of this was went in grazia, so that, you know, reaching this fashion audience who wouldn't necessarily maybe take that interest then. And this was a few years ago, so this was before the age of Instagram. So I just share this example to, you know, express about constantly rethinking the form, the different ways of telling it, and again bringing it back to this idea of the strange. You know, most people know about the climate crisis now, unless they've been hiding. So we really need to think about new ways beyond just illustration, of bringing into question the different relationships, the different ways that this is playing out as well. So all of this work and all of this, you know, years of activism that I myself have been engaging in, you know, when I take a longer view as well, I understand that this work is happening as part of a legacy of generations of environmental justice activists who have been working to, you know, for their land rights, for their rights to their territory, and that the environmental crisis is essentially a land rights crisis. And so I wanted to just share a little bit here about Kensaraweera and the Agoni Nine, who I take a lot of inspiration from because of the organizing that happened in Nigeria against Shell Oil, who were devastating the Niger Delta, and who eventually were complicit in the murder of Kensaraweera and the Agoni Nine. But the thing about Ken that stands out for me the most was that he was also a dramatist and a playwright, and he wrote this almost comedy show, almost like an EastEnders of Nigeria, where he would bring in the stories about, you know, workers, about land rights into that space as well. So always thinking about how do we bring this into the pop realm, but without reducing the message, without just reducing it to, you know, just stopping straws will stop the climate crisis, but thinking about how we bring the nuance of the social issues of these complexities into our pop culture as well. And a few years ago, I worked with a British Nigerian artist, Sakari Douglas Camp, for the 20th year anniversary of the execution of Kensaraweera, and she built this incredible sculpture that was like a bus, and it had travelled across the UK for many years, telling the story of Kensaraweera and the Agoni Nine, talking about oil and complicity. And in the back of it, there's actually a theatre and a library to continue to tell that story. And at the 20th year anniversary of their untimely death, the communities in Nigeria actually asked for this bus to come back to Nigeria. So I worked with Sakari to try and get this onto a ship and to send it back to Nigeria. And the twist was that actually the colonel who was responsible for the death of Kensaraweera took the bus, impounded it, and we never saw it again. So what we did was we worked with graphic designer John Daniel, who's done a lot of graphic design for different hip hop and funk movements, designed these posters for us. Sadly, he's passed on. And we tried to really create a story about the bus. So, you know, you can hold the bus, but they can't stop the movement. And there was this idea that through the bus, we could spark the imagination of this movement. And this story went across Twitter and it became viral. And suddenly there was this new generation trying to get this bus free. And it was a way that the story could translate to the next generation. So also thinking about how can we turn when things don't go right, that we can still turn the absence of the bus became this way that we could tell a story. And we also went and tried to negotiate with the government in Nigeria to also call for other things, such as the cleanup of the Niger Delta, for the impact assessments of the environmental situation there. So again, this idea, how do you work with the artwork to support these deeper needs of the community? How are you working in solidarity with them? And how do you turn those moments when things don't go quite right to try and catalyze a conversation? So as you can see, there's this whole history of movements and organizing that I myself are part of, and people coming into the climate movement are part of. But what we've experienced continually has been this erasure and this colonialism and white supremacy within environmental activism and ecological cultural movements as well. And so a lot of the work that we end up doing as organizers, as cultural producers in this work, is often challenging the white supremacy within the movement itself. So, you know, groups like XR who emerged recently, this brand emerged recently, have done a lot of work, obviously, to popularize the climate crisis. But as you can see, these cultures were already moving. They were already going towards that tipping point. And so why I talk about cultures of activism is to, one, bring up these legacies for our own communities to understand that we have a lineage of climate organizing that's been going, but also to think about how the form of activism, the visualization, you know, here you see white organizers with a pro-police messaging, how that acts as a barrier to our communities taking action, how it erases a history of organizing. And if we make it a form question, if we talk about the forms of activisms themselves, we can start to imagine forms of activism that will actually allow us all to take place in that, and also won't do this violence of erasure. And so there's many ways that many of us have had to almost waste the last few years rewriting ourselves back into the climate of the history of climate organizing and communications. So I found the way to do that has been to work in the arts, to hold conversations around power and privilege, and not in a way that is just to make everyone feel bad for being white and middle class, but to really think about how does that affect the design decisions that you make. You know, once we have an awareness of our power and our privilege, both in our own lives, in the institutions, in the organizations, in the forms that we create, then we're able to create this flexibility and this self-reflexivity to start to make different design decisions and different ways of thinking about that. So I've been doing these power and privilege workshops in different organizations, different galleries, different nonprofits, as a way towards that self-reflexivity that we need to move forward. And so part of that was a research station that I created called ECHO, which was about recentering our cultures of activism. You can see the listening device there. And a lot of the time it's about even holding safe space for conversation about the ways which activism can replicate oppressions itself, what those forms look like, and again, mainly to give us space to start to imagine what we need moving forward. And so a lot of the time, you know, for me, the way that work evolved was that I ended up becoming a podcast producer, working at the, worked with the Doc Society, different spaces to try and recenter. We're talking about recentering, you know, it's not about attacking individuals in the movement. It's about making sure that we're not wasting a whole nother generation having to fight for basic diversity within those spaces. And it's important to know that the you know, environmental sector is the second least diverse sector in the UK. So the racism there, the white supremacy there is very endemic, and that's why I work to communicate this to the culture sector, different places, to understand the allyship that we need as people of colour in the ecological movement and the resources, and to also express why it can be devastating to replicate this white supremacy. So as digital producers, as curators, as those of you who are programming the stories and the works about climate change, it's really important to make sure that our voices are at the center of that. And so this is a collaboration that I did, just this past year. And it was about looking at the voices, lifting up the voices of those communities who have been, working for environmental justice since the get-go. And this was with Yara and Davina and the collective that had this idea of arrivals and departures. So these are the dates of the arrivals of people on the earth and the day they left. And it was at Somerset House. So you can see how much work, how much energy gets used just to continually put ourselves back into the story, put ourselves back into the narrative. And we need to find ways to, again, find allies that keep our voices at the center of it, so we're not wasting all of our energy on fighting that within the movement, because there's life and death at stake for this. Last year there was a massive cyclone, and another cyclone has just hit this region in the Sundarbans in the Bay of Bengal. This was a climate catastrophe. It impacted millions of people, and it was absolutely met with radio silence from both the climate movement and the general public. And so what I set to do was I worked with some artists who were in the region at the time, and we were trying to get out the message about what was happening on the ground, the emergency care that was needed. But there was an absolute broken telephone between the front line of the climate impacts that we're already living through and the climate cultures and the NGOs and all of this infrastructure that exists. So what we need is to really repair this broken telephone. And that means, how do we get the kinds of devices, literally cultures of and resources to the communities who have been resisting, and also for what we actually need. Do we need more big sculptures that just say climate change is happening? Or do we need more sophisticated modes of communication, of interconnectivity, of ways of responding to the humanitarian disasters that are already happening? So that's kind of the question that I'm going to leave you with these last few minutes. This is actually an NFT that MIA created recently to try and get some frontline support to people who have been impacted by the volcano in St. Vincent. And I think it's a really interesting image for us to end with, because it's really thinking about, where we're at with the climate crisis. We're already in it. Our communities are already living through that devastation. They're already living through the humanitarian disasters. So how are we going to build a future climate movement that is responsive to what's happening? It's actually embedded in those communities, that we reverse the white supremacy of the environmental movement, so that the resources, the telephone lines, the media capacity is with us. And how do we do that fast? Because the environmental sector itself, I've been trying to change it for 10 years, is very stuck in its ways. So we need allies, we need a new way of doing environmental activism, new forms, and new capacities as well, to get to the future, both to a just future, to transition our energy systems, but also to ensure that those communities who are living through this, who are also trying to survive through the pandemic, that we can hear them and we can be in solidarity and allyship with them. So I really invite you to, imagine with us, dream with us, explore your power and privilege to think about how you can work alongside the climate movement and how you can build that relationship as well. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you, Suzanne, for joining us at Abandoned Normal Devices this year. I've just switched our names around here. Hey, Suzanne. So my name's Luke Moody. I'm the creative director at Abandoned Normal Devices, pronouns he, him, and I am with a mustache, and I'm sat in front of a brick wall here. Suzanne, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you for this presentation. To anyone who's watching on the YouTube live, you should have a panel to the right of your screen or to the bottom of it. And you can add in questions there, and I will communicate those to Suzanne directly. We have about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. So I will begin, but feel free to drop in some questions there. If you're joining us after the liveness, you can't obviously contribute any questions in there, but feel free to tweet things directly. So hey, Suzanne, thank you for the talk. I firstly wanted to listening to your the very initial part of your talk, I really love this idea of an amplification of listening, and wanted to ask you a little bit more about the role of art within this, within both ecological and land justice movements. I'm thinking particularly at the moment about Palestine and divestment movements. If you could speak a little bit more about how perhaps you've worked with art organizations, and how you see art having a role in an amplification of listening and understanding.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of realms of art that play into that. One of it being, the research that we do as practitioners, the relationships that we build, and that whole way that we approach an issue. And I think it's really important that, especially when we're trying to decolonize, that we enter into a situation with a different mode. So for instance, looking at those pictures of that landscape with feeling, with grief, not necessarily just analyzing it. So I think that's really important, that we bring all of our sensitivities and to the situations. And then the other side of that is to, really think about, as I mentioned, most people know about the climate crisis, that it's happening. People know about Palestine and Gaza, but sometimes we need new ways to be moved by it, to be able to consume that information. And that sounds kind of didactic, but we're constantly being beat over the head with this information, but at the same time, sometimes it needs to move us in a different way, in an emotional way. And I think it's also about capacity. Often, the mainstream media, hard to get these stories through. So often digital communications, all of those other forms are really essential to amplify and to push it to a tipping point as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the need for new images in a way. Obviously, we're speaking in the context here of a festival of digital culture, a festival of new cinema, which has, of course, like a broad reach and audience, but often has a barrier towards its creation. And its creation is by nature drawing upon power, drawing upon, quite literally upon power with the, you mentioned NFTs. And there's been a lot of talk around that recently, around the impact of NFTs and other forms of digital production and the impact they have upon our environments and lack of sustainability. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about examples of artworks that you've perhaps been embedded with or come across that for you kind of lead the way, for you provide new images and an ability to kind of create this new conscience.
Yeah, I think I shared at the end that image of that NFT that MIA created, which was an emergency response to a humanitarian disaster. And I think that really awakened in me the possibility that we need, because we need new capital in these spaces of disaster response. I worked at Doctors Without Borders, Medicine Sans Frontières for a long time, and there was a complete disconnect between climate change. They wouldn't even accept it until a few months ago that it was happening, and what's happening on the ground. So thinking of new ways that, art is capital, as Joseph Boy says, and so we do need new capital in the space. Since then, there's been Indian-based engineers who've made NFTs to bring impacts for care for people impacted by cyclones and COVID. So even though we know that there is a climate or energy impact associated with these, we have to level that up with what's possible, and these things are happening, and how do we get involved in them to move that. So those are some of the things that I found really inspiring. And then also kind of old school has been Joseph Boyce. I've been really inspired by questioning who is the artist, who is the activist, that beginning of questioning outside of the white wall, and how we are shapeshifters between that space in order to respond to what's needed as well.
Yeah, and you speak very kind of wisely on agency and the need for people to feel they have an agency, in a sense. And I think that's maybe the difficulty of a larger movement where you mentioned XR, where your role can feel less direct, perhaps. Can you talk a little bit about, you also mentioned legacy, the fact that you've been campaigning for over a decade, and there's perhaps a frustration with progress, and there may be kind of newer, more nimble movements that are adapting more quickly and making more progress in, you know, on a smaller scale. Could you maybe mention some examples of things that are inspiring you right now in terms of new movements?
Yeah, I think exactly what you said there, legacy, ancestry is really important, especially I think as, you know, within the UK, we often don't see ourselves reflected in the David Attenborough or the images of environmental activism. So it's really important to think about, you know, sometimes what's going on back home or where we come from. And the context I think at the moment is also the farmers' protest that's been happening in India for 6 months now. So for 6 months, you know, farmers, women, men, children have been sat trying to revoke laws that impede their ability to, you know, continue to be farmers. So these are land movements, which are essentially also ecological movements, social justice movements, labor movements. And I think it's really exciting because those connect the dots between all of these issues that sometimes we just talk about abstractly or theoretically. So I think that's part of the decolonization, is to really have an international perspective of understanding movements that already have that interconnection implicitly, that work movement-wide, but don't necessarily get the kudos from the intellectualization of movements. So, you know, being with your ancestry, keeping an international lens, building those relationships, I think really it stirs your own agency as well, because then you're not trying to have to be part of some movement to do it. You can understand your own place in it as well.
Yeah, and I think solidarity is a term that you used in your talk, which is, yeah, very, very important in that context. We've got a question in the chat here from Sinead. She asks if you can talk a little bit more about the controversy around NFTs and their relationship to the environment, the fact that they are so reliable on you know, such high power to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are high, and I know that you know, people like Elon Musk have called on Bitcoin to address their emissions. China has called on, you know, they're investigating which ones are powered by coal. But I think we have to really, when we're talking about emergency situations like the ones I was talking about, we're talking about quickly getting capital that's already generated to the emergency situation, and also money. It's interesting in this conversation, like money's not clean. Like the money that we have has come from genocide, it's come from slavery. Lloyd's of London was built on slavery. So we have to really be careful that, yes, there's obviously going to be an impact because it's the way it's generated. But at the same time, we need to be involved in that conversation. We need to push it onto renewable energy. We need to question it. But I think we have to be careful that we don't, there's this kind of reaction to it that is a bit simplistic. And I think instead we should be calling for it to be renewable. And we need to continue to investigate, well, what is the economic system that we're coming out of that has spurned the creation of a lot of these cryptocurrencies and alternative spaces as well.
Thank you, Suzanne. There are no more questions in the chat at the moment. I wondered if you could talk a little bit around the podcast that you've been producing with Dog Society and the role in that of kind of amplification and reaching a wider audience.
Yeah, so that was a few years back, and it was initially 2 white hosts. And so I came into that trying to sort of push the fact that there needed to be guests of color. And it's really interesting because now we're in a place where the conversations about racism, diversity and climate change have kind of mainstream, but this was really back at that time where we were trying to really still push for basic visibility. So the role I played in that is often, researching with the speakers, but also we have to push back on narratives. For instance, there was an episode which talked about population control. As people of color, population control and who gets to decide the autonomy of our bodies and who's going to decide which populations need to be reduced come with racial implications. So a lot of the time when you're in these production spaces, you're having to have really difficult conversations. You're having to challenge narrative. You're having to, and that was a really, really difficult job to have and to take. But I think it has shifted a little bit now. I do think we do have more diversity, but I think it's really important to understand that when you have people of color who are in a production space or on a team, and it's something about climate change, that some of those decisions, some of those narratives are super painful and they have deep implications. So you really have to support the person who's having to say those difficult things and take their lead a little bit as well. And it's hard to do that alone. So I was the only person of color at that time.
Yeah,
but, and I think also digital media played a big role in that, reaching new audiences with that. And at the time, I think it was a little bit about also convincing white people to have an anti-racist stance in their climate change. But I think we've reached a point now where whoever we've got from the white middle class sector, who's going to come with us, is going to come. And now how do we produce more media that's like from our perspective, speaking to each other, amplifying a lot of the frontline situations.
Yeah, and as you say, really recognizing the kind of intersectional impact of this idea of justice. And I think like there has been perhaps a positive shift in recent years of climate change being more the center of what we would call broadcast. So beyond smaller art spheres and beyond campaign forums. Could you comment a little bit around on that and whether you think it's a positive thing that it's moving to more of a central conversation, perhaps on the likes of BBC or Attenborough on Netflix and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think, when we were doing a lot of this work a few years ago, and it was, frontline Indigenous movements, a lot of grassroots movements, we knew it was going to reach a tipping point. And it was a question of who was going to control that narrative when it happened. And I think in a way, a lot of it got co-opted. Like, it's great that David Attenborough is speaking on this, but he also has a pretty dark sense of population control. And I think in mainstreaming it, some of it got sort of dumbed down as well. We suddenly were talking about straws and we were talking about plastic, which isn't necessarily about the climate crisis in terms of extraction, land rights. It became more about these kind of side environmental issues. So I think on the one hand, yes, it's popularized, but we still need more control of the narrative, as I said, so that it's more complex. And that also that we're not just brought in to add the color and stir on the broadcast, but that we have resources to produce our own content, that it's going to the stations that we need, and we have the research time as well. And I would say that's the same with galleries. We're often brought on for the talks and the side show in a sense, but we need more spaces of curation, research grants as well. So I think it's mainstream, but how it did it was really shocking. Like, when I saw XR and Greta and what happened, it was a nightmare. I was like, oh my God, now we're gonna have to carve ourselves back into it. The climate literacy went backwards. So I think we're in this moment, and I try and keep balance. It has scaled up, but now how do we complicate it again? And how do we, as I mentioned in the talk, how do we make sure that we have access to The Guardian when we need to get news about a cyclone out? We can't, because they're too busy covering XR, gluing themselves to something again. So that's something to really think about. Why do we communicate, and how do we do it, and how do we have that means of production?
And as we're drawing to a close, and you were speaking of resources and having the space to complicate things, could you speak a little bit about what you're working on now and exactly what resources you need? I guess would be quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have a Patreon on my website, and that's one way. I think the other way is exactly what I mentioned there about if people are curating, you're making festivals, you have access to grants around climate change, collaborate, partner with other people like myself who move between arts and activism, support people to write funding grants. You know, you'd be surprised how difficult that can be when you're responding to those situations. So any ways that you can work in direct collaboration with people is one way to do that. And then I think the other thing is, spaces like this giving voice, and also to think about what we're going to be doing in the next while. Like if you're thinking ahead of your programming on climate change, something I said there about, does it need to be illustrative? I think we already know, and most people know that the climate change is happening. So we need to move beyond just like, oh, icebergs melting, it's happening, like coming up with more sophisticated projects as well that work at this kind of empathetic, responsive, ground-based solidarity, and doing that in the arts work as a way to move that resources there as well. I think that's another way of doing that. And then also with media, if you are in media, if you are in journalism, making those relationships with the people who don't necessarily have the big Instagram followings, but who've been doing this work a long time, so that you're getting the stories from those people as well, and on building frontline relationships as well.
Well, a huge thank you for joining us, Suzanne. We're a massive fan of your work, and I hope more people can join us afterwards and watch this on YouTube post-event. Are there any last questions as we're drawing to an end? I can't see any in the chat coming in. But thank you very much for joining us, Suzanne. And yeah, just to echo your message, let's complicate things more. Let's abandon normal devices. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yes, bye.
Bye.